The Galactic Council's Beast Repository was, quite possibly, the most depressing establishment in the known universe, and that was saying something, considering the existence of the Centaurian DMV and the Betelgeusian tax office. Floating like an oversized soup can in the midst of nowhere particularly interesting, the station served as a dumping ground for what the galaxy's civilized species considered their mistakes, rejects, and general embarrassments in the animal kingdom. Ambassador Nx'thorax, the station's caretaker, stood at his observation window, all 6 of his eyes twitching in different directions, a sure sign of stress in Proximan physiology. Below him, in what could generously be called the reception area, 3 different species were attempting to abandon their unwanted pets simultaneously. The sight would have been comical if it weren't so pathetically common. "But it developed sentience," squeaked a Ragelian, pushing forward what appeared to be a crystalline octopus. "That wasn't in the brochure when I bought it. How am I supposed to eat my morning minerals with something that keeps solving quantum equations on my bathroom mirror?" Next to them, a vegan, not the Earth dietary choice, but rather a being from Vega, was attempting to explain why their atmospheric processor had become too emotionally needy. The processor, a cloud-like creature that helped terraform environments, was currently spelling out "please don't leave me" in perfect galactic standard using its own condensation. "Look," Nx'thorax said through the intercom, his translator struggling to convey both professional courtesy and deep existential exhaustion. The repository was established by the Galactic Council as a last resort facility, not a convenient dumping ground for every slightly inconvenient pet that doesn't match your apartment's color scheme. He was, of course, talking to the 3rd visitor, a Syrian aristocrat who was trying to surrender what they claimed was an aesthetically incompatible companion animal. The creature in question was quietly reading a magazine in the corner. The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom, and here Nx'thorax's internal monologue dripped with enough sarcasm to fill a small moon, had decided that establishing a central facility for problematic creatures was better than having them released into various ecosystems. What they'd actually created was the galaxy's largest collection of misunderstood beings, all housed under one thoroughly overwhelmed Proximan's supervision. Nx'thorax's console beeped, another incoming transport. He didn't need to check the manifest to know it would be carrying yet another creature that some species had decided was too ugly, too smart, or too inconvenient to keep. Sometimes during his mandatory rest cycles, he wondered if the Council had chosen him for this position as some sort of elaborate punishment for that diplomatic incident involving the Grand Poobah of Betelgeuse and the misplaced rubber duck. The day the Nx'thorax arrived changed everything, though Nx'thorax wouldn't realize it until much later. The creature came in an environmental containment unit that had seen better days, probably back when the galaxy was still young. Through the scratched, grimy viewport, Nx'thorax could make out what appeared to be a shifting mass of iridescent tentacles, crystalline spines, and what might have been either fur or very enthusiastic mold. "It's a Nx'thorax," the previous owner, a draconid merchant, announced with the kind of tone usually reserved for announcing terminal diseases or impending tax audits. "It was supposed to be a bioorganic computing system, top of the line, cost me half a solar system's worth of credits." Nx'thorax's antennae twitched. "And the problem is?" The draconid scale shifted from emerald to a nauseated purple. "It started developing, growing. The manual said nothing about it gaining additional appendages or developing a preference for classical music. And the singing. Do you know how disturbing it is to wake up to a biocomputer performing opera?" The creature in the container shifted, and through the grime, Nx'thorax swore he saw what looked like sheet music being traced by one of its crystalline appendages. The movement revealed patches of its skin that seemed to change color in response to the conversation, creating patterns that reminded him of abstract art he'd once seen in a Centaurian gallery. "It's also developed some rather unconventional features," the merchant continued, backing away from the container as if the Nx'thorax might suddenly burst out and demand an encore performance. Those spines weren't part of the original design, neither was the ability to solve complex mathematical equations through interpersonal dance. A small crowd of repository staff had gathered, maintaining what they considered a safe distance. The arthropodian medical officer clicked her mandibles in what might have been either scientific interest or an attempt not to laugh. The Nx'thorax responded by rearranging its spines into what was unmistakably a geometric proof of the Pythagorean theorem. The final straw, the Draconid said, voice dropping to a whisper, was when it started leaving book recommendations. Literary analysis. Can you imagine? I ordered a computer, not a culture critic. Nx'thorax studied the creature more closely. Beneath the layers of neglect and grime, there was something almost graceful about its movements. The spines, which had initially appeared threatening, arranged themselves in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a living art installation. Even its supposedly horrifying appendages moved with a kind of choreographed precision that suggested intelligence rather than chaos. The others won't go near it, the merchant added, already backing toward the exit. They say it's unsettling, unnatural. It doesn't fit any known classification. It's just wrong. The Nx'thorax pressed what might have been a tendril against the container's viewport, leaving a perfect fractal pattern in the condensation. Underneath the pattern, Nx'thorax could make out words in perfectly rendered Galactic standard. The container's atmospheric recycling unit needs maintenance. Also, has anyone here read Proust? As the Draconid practically fled the repository, Nx'thorax found himself wondering if the real problem wasn't that the Nx'thorax was wrong, but that it was too right in all the wrong ways for a galaxy that preferred its biological computers to stick to computing and its art critics to stick to having a maximum of 4 appendages. The human delegation arrived exactly 1 standard galactic week after the Nx'thorax incident, though Nx'thorax would have sworn the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. 3 humans strode into the repository, like they owned the place, which, given humanity's habit of enthusiastically inserting themselves into any situation they found interesting, wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility. Dr. Chen led the group, a xenobiologist whose reputation preceded her mainly because she had once successfully negotiated a peace treaty between 2 warring species by pointing out that their conflict originated from a misinterpreted cat meme. Behind her came Professor Williams, an expert in xenopsychology, who had famously published a paper titled "Why Your Anti-Social Defense Mechanism is Actually Adorable," a study of predatory species in diplomatic settings. Bringing up the rear was Dr. Rodriguez, a specialist in exotic veterinary medicine who approached every new species with the enthusiasm of a child discovering that ice cream exists. The moment they laid eyes on the Nx'thorax, their reactions were, well, decidedly human. "Oh my God, look at those crystalline formations." Dr. Chen practically bounced on her toes. "The way they refract light is incredible. And did you see that? It's using chromatic aberration to communicate." Professor Williams was already taking notes. "The geometric patterns it's creating show clear signs of advanced mathematical understanding, but with an artistic flair. It's not just calculating, it's expressing itself through mathematics. That's absolutely fascinating." And those tentacles, Dr. Rodriguez had somehow already produced a scanner from nowhere in particular. The dexterity required for such precise movements. This isn't just a biocomputer gone rogue, this is an entirely new form of sentient expression. The other species in the repository watched this display with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching someone try to juggle antimatter. A Rigelian diplomat dropped their datapad. An Arcturian security officer's protective scales stood on end. The Arthropodian medical officer's mandibles clicked in what was definitely confusion this time. But it's hideous," protested a passing Syrian ambassador, all 7 of their sensory stalks recoiling in disgust. Dr. Chen turned with the kind of smile that suggested she was about to educate someone, whether they wanted it or not. "Have you ever seen a blobfish in its natural habitat? Or a naked mole rat caring for its colony? Earth species that others might consider ugly often turn out to be the most fascinating." The Nx'thorax, seemingly encouraged by this unexpected appreciation, began performing what appeared to be an interpretive dance about the fundamental forces of the universe. Its spines arranged themselves into a perfect model of atomic structure, while its tentacles traced the mathematical equations describing quantum entanglement. "Look," Professor Williams pointed excitedly, "it's expressing complex scientific concepts through movement. This isn't just intelligence. It's a completely unique form of cognitive processing." A small crowd had gathered, watching in bewilderment as the humans continued to express increasing levels of enthusiasm about features that most species had found disturbing. The Nx'thorax, for its part, seemed to be blossoming under the attention, its colors shifting through patterns that somehow managed to convey both complex theoretical physics and what appeared to be a critique of postmodern literature. Ambassador Nx'thorax, Dr. Chen turned to address the thoroughly confused Proximan. We'd like to formally request permission to study and work with the Nx'thorax. We believe it represents not just a new form of intelligence, but potentially a bridge between biological and computational consciousness. You want to study it? Nx'thorax's translator struggled to convey his disbelief. Not remove it, not contain it, not request it be transferred to a secure facility. Dr. Rodriguez looked offended at the very suggestion. Contain it? Why would we want to contain something this remarkable? Did you know it just expressed Fermat's last theorem through interpersonal dance? That's not something you contain, that's something you celebrate. The Nx'thorax, apparently understanding the conversation, began generating a series of harmonic tones that somehow managed to sound like a cross between a symphony orchestra and a quantum computer having an existential crisis. The humans looked delighted. The rest of the repository's staff looked like they were questioning every life choice that had led them to this moment. And Nx'thorax, watching as Dr. Chen began attempting to communicate with the Nx'thorax through a combination of mathematical equations and modern dance, realized that his job was about to become either much more interesting or much more complicated. Possibly both. The human research team transformed an unused storage bay into what they called their interactive understanding space, though most of the repository's staff referred to it as that place where chaos lives now. Within days, the sterile room had become a riot of color, movement, and what Dr. Chen insisted was structured creative expression. The Nx'thorax, freed from its deteriorating containment unit, proved to be even more remarkable than initially suspected. Its crystalline spines, when properly cleaned and cared for, could generate holographic displays that made quantum mechanics look like a child's picture book. The supposedly horrifying tentacles turned out to be capable of manipulating energy fields with the precision of a master artist working in 4 dimensions. Look at this, Dr. Rodriguez called out one morning, pointing to what appeared to be a floating symphony of mathematical equations. It's not just solving complex problems, it's creating entirely new ways of approaching them. These aren't just calculations, they're mathematical poetry. The creature had developed a particular fondness for Earth's classical music, often accompanying Mozart with its own unique interpretations that somehow managed to improve upon the original compositions. This led to the somewhat surreal sight of a crystalline tentacled entity conducting an invisible orchestra, while simultaneously proving string theory through interpersonal dance. Professor Williams spent hours documenting what she called emotional cognitive integration patterns, though Nx'thorax suspected she was just having fascinating conversations with the universe's most unusual book club member. The Nx'thorax had apparently developed strong opinions about Earth literature, particularly fond of works that explored the nature of consciousness and existence. It just spent 3 hours explaining why Kafka's Metamorphosis is actually a comedy, Professor Williams announced during one of their daily briefings. And honestly, its interpretation makes more sense than any I've heard in 30 years of academic study. The breakthrough came during what the humans called Creative Expression Thursday, a weekly event that had most of the repository's other inhabitants finding urgent business on the opposite side of the station. Dr. Chen had introduced the concept of abstract painting, and the Nx'thorax had taken to it with unprecedented enthusiasm. It's not just creating art, Dr. Chen explained to an increasingly bewildered Galactic Council representative. It's developing an entirely new form of communication. Look at this. Each painting contains layers of meaning. The surface level is pure aesthetic beauty, but beneath that are mathematical formulas, beneath those are philosophical concepts, and underneath everything is what appears to be a rather scathing criticism of current galactic economic policies. The Nx'thorax, apparently pleased with this understanding, generated a series of crystalline formations that simultaneously proved the Riemann hypothesis and suggested improvements to the Galactic Council's recycling program. Dr. Rodriguez's medical examinations revealed that what had been dismissed as random mutations were actually purposeful adaptations. The creature wasn't malfunctioning, it was evolving. Each new appendage, each crystalline growth served a specific purpose in its ever-expanding means of expression and understanding. It's developed specialized neural clusters that process information in ways we've never seen before, Dr. Rodriguez explained, waving a scanner excitedly. It's not just thinking, it's experiencing thought in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it creates art or music, it's actually manipulating the fundamental forces of the universe to express concepts that most species can't even perceive. The humans documented everything with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. They filled data sticks with observations about how the Nx'thorax used color-shifting patterns to express emotional states, how its crystalline structures could store and process information in ways that made quantum computers look primitive, and how its tentacles could manipulate energy fields to create living sculptures of pure mathematics. "Watch this," Dr. Chen said one day, pointing to where the Nx'thorax was engaged in what appeared to be a one-entity performance of the entire history of philosophy. It's not just recreating ideas, it's synthesizing them, finding connections that no one else has ever noticed. Yesterday it resolved 3 major philosophical paradoxes, while explaining why Earth's duck-billed platypus is actually the perfect metaphor for the nature of reality. The other species in the repository gradually began to show cautious interest, drawn in despite themselves by the humans' infectious enthusiasm. Even Nx'thorax found himself looking forward to the Nx'thorax's daily presentations, which ranged from solving century-old mathematical problems to providing surprisingly insightful relationship advice to lovelorn staff members. "You know," Professor Williams mused one evening as they watched the Nx'thorax recreate the entire works of Shakespeare through a combination of bioluminescence and quantum entanglement, "maybe the real problem wasn't that it was too complex or too ugly. Maybe the problem was that everyone was so busy trying to make it fit their preconceptions that they never bothered to let it show them who it actually was." The Nx'thorax responded to this observation by creating a perfect fractal pattern that somehow managed to be both a stunning visual representation of the concept of prejudice and a rather pointed commentary on the Galactic Council's standardized testing procedures. The rehabilitation process began with what Dr. Rodriguez called environmental enrichment, but what looked to most observers like controlled chaos. The humans transformed the Nx'thorax's living space into what they termed a multisensory development zone, complete with various textures, sounds, and interactive elements that made most other species wonder if Earth's definition of organized had somehow gotten lost in translation. "The key," Dr. Rodriguez explained to an increasingly fascinated audience, "is understanding that physical and emotional well-being are interconnected. We're not just treating the symptoms of neglect, we're helping it rediscover its joy in existence." The Nx'thorax's crystalline spines, once dulled by neglect, began to shine with an inner light that transformed the entire chamber into a living aurora. Its tentacles, previously moved with hesitation, now danced through the air with confidence, creating complex patterns that somehow managed to combine advanced physics with what appeared to be interpretive dance reviews of Earth's entire entertainment history. "Look at how it's responding to positive reinforcement," Dr. Chen pointed out during one session, as the Nx'thorax solved differential equations while simultaneously composing a sonata about the beauty of prime numbers. "It's not just healing, it's flourishing." The turning point came during what the humans called expression therapy, but what the rest of the station had come to know as that time of day when physics gets weird. The Nx'thorax had been attempting to express its feelings about its previous treatment through a combination of color patterns and mathematical theorems when something unexpected happened. An Arcturian diplomat passing by the observation window stopped to watch. Instead of the usual reaction of horror or disgust, they tilted their head in what might have been consideration. "The way it's using non-Euclidean geometry to express emotional trauma, it's actually quite beautiful," they admitted, sounding surprised at their own words. This small moment of appreciation sparked something in the Nx'thorax. Its colors shifted through a spectrum that somehow conveyed both gratitude and an advanced theory of consciousness. while its crystalline structures arranged themselves into what Professor Williams later described as the most elegant proof of emotional intelligence I've ever seen. Soon, other species began to linger near the observation windows. A young Rehabilitation student started taking notes on the Nx'thorax's unique approach to solving quantum mechanical problems. A vegan atmospheric scientist requested permission to attend the creature's impromptu lectures on multidimensional fluid dynamics. It's not just about physical rehabilitation, Professor Williams explained during one of their now crowded daily briefings. It's about creating an environment where being different isn't seen as a flaw, but as an opportunity for new perspectives. The Nx'thorax thrived under the human's care, developing new and increasingly sophisticated ways of expressing itself. What had once been seen as disturbing mutations were revealed to be evolutionary adaptations that allowed for complex forms of communication and understanding. Even Nx'thorax found himself drawn into the creature's orbit. Yesterday, he admitted during a staff meeting, it helped me understand a complex diplomatic protocol by expressing it through a combination of crystalline formations and what I believe was an homage to Earth's Broadway musicals. The humans' approach to care went beyond mere physical maintenance. They encouraged the Nx'thorax's intellectual curiosity, provided it with access to various forms of art and literature, and even organized what they called cultural exchange sessions where the creature could share its unique perspectives with interested parties. "Watch this," Dr. Rodriguez said one day, gesturing to where the Nx'thorax was engaged in what appeared to be a complex discussion about consciousness with a group of previously skeptical Centaurian philosophers. The creature was simultaneously generating holographic representations of various theories of mind, while using its bioluminescence to provide footnotes and citations. The most remarkable transformation wasn't just in the Nx'thorax's physical appearance or capabilities, but in how others began to perceive it. What had once been seen as a malfunction or aberration was increasingly recognized as a unique form of evolution, one that challenged preconceptions about intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of beauty itself. As Professor Williams noted in her daily log, perhaps the greatest rehabilitation hasn't been of the Nx'thorax, but of how we define normal in a galaxy full of infinite possibilities. The story of the Nx'thorax went viral across the galactic information networks faster than a Photonian sugar rush. News outlets couldn't get enough of what they called the Beast Repository Revolution, though most of them struggled to capture footage of the creature without their cameras experiencing existential crises. Breaking news: unconventional biocomputer proves beauty standards are relative, possibly quantum-based, read the headlines on the Galactic Daily. The accompanying video showed the Nx'thorax solving advanced mathematical equations through interpersonal dance while simultaneously critiquing the media's coverage of non-standard life forms. The Syrian news network ran a special feature titled "When Ugly Turns Beautiful, A Journey Through Human Perspectives." Their ratings skyrocketed, particularly after the Nx'thorax sent in a guest editorial that somehow managed to be both a scathing criticism of beauty standards and a proof of the unified field theory. The impact rippled through galactic society like a wave of common sense, which, as any historian could tell you, was far rarer than any supernatural phenomenon. Species that had previously prided themselves on their aesthetic superiority found themselves awkwardly reassessing their stance, particularly after the Nx'thorax series of performance art pieces titled "Beauty is a Four-Dimensional Construct. Deal with it." The repository's adoption rates for aesthetically challenging creatures shot up faster than a Venusian rocket powered by embarrassment. Suddenly, having a unique or unusual companion animal became the height of sophisticated taste. The same Draconid merchant who had abandoned the Nx'thorax was spotted at a high society gathering, desperately trying to claim they had always appreciated non-traditional beauty. Yesterday, Nx'thorax reported during a staff meeting, his antenna twitching with barely suppressed amusement. A Rehabilitation fashion designer requested permission to base their new collection on what they called the revolutionary asymmetry of evolved computing systems. I believe they were politely turned down via an interpretive dance number about the commercialization of identity. The Galactic Council, never one to miss a chance to pretend they'd been progressive all along, quickly established the Diversity in Companion Beings initiative. The fact that this initiative was announced right after the Nx'thorax published a mathematical proof demonstrating the correlation between societal advancement and acceptance of diversity was, they insisted, purely coincidental. Professor Williams found herself flooded with requests for interviews, particularly after publishing her paper, Beyond Binary Beauty: How Human Perspective Challenged Galactic Standards. The paper became required reading in xenopsychology courses across the galaxy, though students often complained that the accompanying performance art was difficult to replicate without extra appendages. The adoption centers across the galaxy reported a strange new phenomenon. Species were specifically requesting companions that others had rejected. A vegan diplomat proudly showed off their newly adopted atmospheric processor that communicated entirely through haiku formed in cloud patterns. A Centaurian artist began a successful career after their malfunction of a quantum paint mixer started creating six-dimensional masterpieces. Dr. Chen's inbox was flooded with messages from various species asking for advice on understanding and appreciating their unique companions. It's not about changing them, she explained during a packed lecture at the Galactic Academy. It's about changing how we see them. The Nx'thorax, who had been invited as a guest lecturer, punctuated this statement by creating a living sculpture that somehow managed to be both a visual representation of perspective shift and a subtle mockery of the Academy's traditional teaching methods. Even the notorious Betelgeusian Pet Aesthetics Committee, known for their strictly regulated beauty standards, found themselves forced to adapt. Their latest handbook included a chapter titled Non-Traditional Beauty: Why That Horrifying Thing Might Actually Be Gorgeous and Why We Totally Knew This All Along. The repository itself became something of a cultural landmark. Species from across the galaxy came to observe what they called the human approach to caring for unique beings. The observation deck had to be expanded 3 times to accommodate all the visitors, though some cynics suggested this was just to give the Nx'thorax more space for its increasingly elaborate performance art pieces about the evolution of galactic society. You know what the really funny part is, Dr. Rodriguez mused one day, watching a group of previously skeptical Arcturians enthusiastically discussing the artistic merits of a creature that looked like a cross between a quantum computer and a Jackson Pollock painting. All we did was treat them like they mattered. Everything else, that was just the galaxy catching up to common sense. 1 year after the humans first arrived at the repository, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session to address what they called the evolving paradigm of non-standard companion beings, though everyone knew they really meant how humans made us all look like insensitive idiots. The Nx'thorax was invited to give the opening address, a historic first that required significant modifications to the council chamber's architecture to accommodate its now spectacular crystalline display of multidimensional thought processes. Its presentation, titled The Mathematics of Compassion, a practical guide to not being a jerk in an infinite universe, received a standing ovation and caused 3 different species to spontaneously evolve additional cognitive functions. As you can see, Dr. Chen addressed the council, while the Nx'thorax illustrated her points through an elaborate combination of quantum physics and interpersonal dance. What we originally considered malfunctions or defects were actually evolutionary adaptations. The Nx'thorax hasn't just recovered. It has become something entirely new, something that challenges our very understanding of consciousness and evolution. The transformation was undeniable. The once rejected biocomputer had evolved into what Professor Williams termed a living library of multidimensional wisdom, though the Nx'thorax preferred to describe itself as a performance artist specializing in quantum mechanics and SAS. Its crystalline structures now housed what was possibly the most advanced processing system in the galaxy, while its tentacles had developed the ability to manipulate reality in ways that made theoretical physicists need to lie down with cold compresses. The Galactic Council, in a display of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested they were capable of learning after all, established the Universal Guidelines for Companion Being Care and Dignity. The document was surprisingly progressive, though some suspected this had less to do with genuine enlightenment and more to do with the fact that the Nx'thorax had been appointed to the drafting committee and had a way of expressing disapproval through mathematically precise guilt trips. Article 1, the new guidelines began, acknowledges that beauty, intelligence, and worth cannot be measured by conventional standards, particularly when dealing with beings capable of proving this mathematically while performing a one-entity recreation of the entire history of theatre. Dr. Rodriguez's veterinary protocols became the new standard across the galaxy, though she insisted that the basic principle was simply treating every being like it matters. The fact that this was revolutionary said more about the galaxy's previous standards than it did about human innovation. The repository itself underwent a complete transformation. Under Nx'thorax's continued leadership, now enthusiastically supported by a staff that had learned to appreciate the unexpected, it evolved from a dumping ground for unwanted creatures into the Galactic Center for Understanding Non-Standard Intelligence. The waiting list for admission grew so long that they had to hire a quantum computer just to manage it, though everyone agreed that it wasn't nearly as good at multitasking as the Nx'thorax. The funny thing, Nx'thorax commented during the center's grand reopening, all six of his eyes crinkled in what had become a genuine smile, is that we didn't actually change any of our residents. We just changed how we saw them. The Nx'thorax celebrated this observation by creating a temporal sculpture that showed the evolution of galactic consciousness regarding non-standard beings, complete with a soundtrack that somehow managed to combine classical music with quantum mechanics and just a hint of justified smugness. The impact on intergalactic animal welfare was profound. Species across the galaxy began reporting unusual behaviors in their supposedly standard companion beings, though, as Professor Williams pointed out, maybe they were always doing interesting things and we were just too busy being normal to notice. The Draconid merchant who had originally abandoned the Nx'thorax made one final appearance at the center, supposedly to make amends. They found themselves on the receiving end of what observers described as the most elegantly savage takedown in history, delivered entirely through a combination of classical dance and quantum entanglement theorems. The merchant left looking both enlightened and slightly singed, though experts couldn't quite explain how mathematical proofs had managed to burn someone's ego so precisely. As the galaxy adjusted to its new perspective on non-standard beings, humans were increasingly called upon to mediate between species and their unusual companions. Their knack for seeing beauty in the unexpected, combined with their stubborn refusal to accept "that's just how things are" as an answer, made them uniquely suited to the role. "You know what the best part is?" Dr. Chen mused during the first anniversary celebration of the new center. Watching as the Nx'thorax conducted a masterclass on multidimensional art appreciation for a group of formerly skeptical Syrian art critics. "We didn't actually teach anyone anything new. We just reminded the galaxy of something it should have known all along, that worth isn't about meeting someone else's standards, it's about having the freedom to define your own." The Nx'thorax marked this profound observation by creating a temporal spatial artwork that somehow managed to be simultaneously a proof of this principle, a critique of conventional wisdom, and what several critics swore was the most beautiful thing they'd ever seen in any dimension. Though some insisted that last part might have been because it also proved the existence of free will, while dunking on traditional beauty standards in 4 different quantum states simultaneously.